Hi, my name is Nick Craig. I'm from Polar Research and Policy Initiative. Thank you very much for sharing some really enlightening insights there. I was just wondering if I could get some perspectives from you guys on what you see the biggest barriers being of scaling these opportunities and these, especially with hydrogen and the offer that has to flexibility in the system. How you take that out of the living laboratory and kind of scale it out, and what policy interventions you'd like to see that could accelerate the use of such technologies. Thanks.
Okay, who would like to take it? No, not everyone has to answer each question. Who would like to take it? Neil, do you want to start?
Oh, well, it looks like because I've got the mic, I'm starting. Is that on?
Yes.
It is fine. Okay, thank you. I think the biggest barrier with hydrogen at the moment is we didn't start it a couple of hundred years ago when we first found hydrogen. So there's a certain familiarity aspect. So, for example, we've been dealing with some organisations which seem incapable of seeing the difference between hydrogen and other gases, say like LNG. LNG is at minus 200 and something odd and pools around your feet, whereas hydrogen is very fugitive, and so the threats posed by them are very different. So trying to make sure that we can explain to people what needs appropriate regulation and really what you don't need to worry about is a bit of an impediment. The scale up, I think. Technologies have a habit of a tendency to scale at a rate that they can manage themselves. In other words, you can only push it to a certain point. If you push it beyond a certain point, you tend to trip over your own feet. And I think we need to recognise that what we're doing at the moment is just some embryonic steps, or nascent steps, and we will need to take more steps and accelerate as we go. But it's important we get these first pieces right and then push to accelerate when we're getting them right. If we try and throw ourselves into something too hard at the start, then the tendency is I think you tend to trip over. So I think it's a degree of patience, but bloody-minded determination as well, not to accept any setbacks, and also just to prove to people it works.
But maybe Enrique or can just pick up on one of these issues, which is that we're seeing a lot of demonstration projects which are funded publicly, which is great, and you can do lots of exploration, lots of understanding, but actually if you're going to scale, you need the market to scale it, and getting from the public funding to the commercial funding is a real challenge. Any thoughts on how you might do that?
I think probably the biggest challenge, I would say, is the economics for these technologies at the moment. So for that, you need the right incentives to be there. They are being deployed, so we're much more advanced than we were like 10 years ago or 15 years ago. I think there's also an element, as Neil mentioned, of social awareness. So you have to do things in steps. When you start talking about, for example, using hydrogen for domestic uses and things like that, you need to be mindful of what you're doing. You need to be mindful of the regulation and also of the perception, the public perception of it. And then the last point I would make is also about regulation. So the challenge with this project is that sometimes there is no regulation. So you're basically creating it. And so you really have to push the boundaries there, but you have to do it in a delicate manner. You have to work with the authorities. And for example, I can tell you that for those trailers that are carrying already hydrogen across the islands, it took us a year to be able to certify them so that they can go on the ferries, because it hasn't been done before. So there is no regulation. So you have to work with the public authorities to create that regulation, and that is quite a big challenge.
Neil, did you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking obviously about quite different technologies here. So hydrogen, there is a lot of technological learning still going on, and costs are likely to come down. But some of the renewable options I was talking about, renewable heat, none of this is, but a lot of it is technologically actually quite mature and applied in other countries. But we have a real problem at the moment that fossil fuel prices are actually too low. Now, obviously, we also need to recognize that, especially if we're talking about the Arctic and we're talking about heat, well, we can't just afford to make heat too expensive because people need warmth, and there are issues around fuel poverty, especially as a lot of these remote communities don't have high incomes. So I cannot see a way of getting around some kind of public funding for some of these projects, to be honest. But for countries more broadly, I mean, we see the one country which has managed to get a very high percentage of renewable heat is Sweden. Now, obviously, there is a very high, good biomass resource as well. But aside from that, the way they've managed to do it is through a carbon tax, which is basically double the cost of heating oil. So we need to think about pricing. And of course, most governments are shying away from that for a variety of reasons. So I think a combination of carbon pricing together with social programs which ensure that, you promote energy efficiency, etc., are needed.
But Ute, can I just, before I pass over to Neil, for many remote communities, they're having to truck in diesel. So actually the price that you're trying to compete against is actually trucked in diesel, which is inherently expensive and often is then being subsidised itself by governments. Exactly. So actually that's the issue, surely, in terms of the system cost and how you might change.
Yeah, I think it depends on how remote we're talking about. But yes, I'm aware that in many places, for social reasons, these costs are subsidised. And of course, there is a good opportunity there then to just switch that subsidy to more sustainable options.
Yeah. Neil, very quick comment, and then I'll come back to more.
Yeah, I was really just going to pick up on the point that you asked for the policy initiative, and I think the carbon pricing is critically there. But we should also look for all the other bits and pieces that are out there that work against efficiency. So the fact that we have to pay VAT on insulation if you're doing a retrofit on a house, but you don't if you're building a new house, it clearly makes no sense at all. And some other raids that have been done on renewables have been pretty reprehensible, such as the removal of the climate change levy, or the imposition of the climate change levy on renewables. The one technology is not contributing to climate change has just been hammered by the government and put a tax on it. So I think we have to be vigilant and make sure that we tackle these iniquities that are in the system whenever they come up.
More questions? Yeah. Please, side. Sorry, at the back first. I'll come back to David.
Simon Marsden, Stirling University. I'm very interested in the new technologies that have been discussed, but one of the concerns that I have is that new technologies can often be deployed for poor purposes. And I read with some concern this year that some countries, there's one rather large one in Central Asia, some distance from the Arctic admittedly, that is now proposing, if they haven't already done so, combining carbon capture and storage technology with coal-fired power plants. I wonder if you've got any comments on that.
Ute, I'm going to pass to you.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure I understand this fully. Andy, sorry.
Can I just confirm, it's a means of delaying any transition to a low-carbon economy to utilise the technology for carbon capture and storage and combine it with coal-fired electric production.
Okay.
Well, I'm not here to defend coal, but the reality is there are a lot of countries which will continue using coal for some time, and you saw from my figure from the World Energy Outlook that, we still expect coal capacity additions in the power sector for the foreseeable future. Now, clearly, combining that with carbon capture and storage is better than emitting the CO2. So, we do see a role for carbon capture and storage, as do many of our member state governments. Of course, it would be much more sensible to push renewables, but I think we have to accept that there will be some of that. But this is, not something that's that relevant to the remote communities we're talking about here.
Okay. David, did you have a question?
My name's David Somerville from Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation. I hope very much that your projection of renewables towards the end of your slideshow is an underestimate, as you've previously underestimated renewable penetration. And I love the last speaker's ambition and wish. One way it strikes me is that we've got, or a problem we seem to have, is that the different fuel industries, the electricity supply industry, the gas supply industry, appear to be still working in silos. And in a certain extent, even with the hydrogen or whatever. And I'm wondering, what opportunities does the panel feel that there might be for using bulk heat as an intermediary buffering between surplus electricity, which Enrique so clearly identified as a problem, and delivering this very substantial volume of low-grade energy that buildings particularly need. So first on a sort of global scale, maybe from the IEA, how can we get the nascent or the emerging heat networks regulation aligned with the possibility of using spill electricity?
Do you want to start? Yeah, maybe
yes. I also hope that, I start with the thing about IEA projections. Of course, I also hope that renewables will do even better than I've shown on there. People often criticize us at SDIEA for underestimating, but actually it's not just us, it's almost everyone. I don't think anyone really saw solar PV taking off as much as it has. Now on the heat, well, you're talking about nascent heat networks, maybe in this country, but of course they're not nascent at all in many other countries, you know, from the Nordics to Central Asia, etc. And in fact, there is a lot already happening on using heat as a way of dealing with surplus electricity. There's even some of this happening in China now, but clearly Denmark, which has more than 50% variable renewables now, mainly from wind. I believe local utilities actually can play an incredibly important role there. Now, of course, not every country still has municipal utilities, but where they exist, and they do in many countries, you know, the Nordics, Germany, etc., they have a really good opportunity of doing this local planning and liaising with the larger utilities who might be producing the electricity. It's slightly more tricky to do it in countries where they don't exist, but you know, often you do end up having the same company now managing the renewable, the heat network, you know, large companies like ENGIE or Fortum or whoever, and they also have a large renewable electricity plant. So I think there's plenty of opportunity there.
But it's, I mean, certainly within the UK, well, within Scotland, we have got some very good examples of surplus electricity being shared into, for example, storage heaters in places like on Mull, the Access project. So you've got good examples of testing and trialling how well that works. It doesn't have to go through a heat network, it can go straight into that. But I just wonder whether, Neil, you wanted to pick up on, obviously your focus on, with you know, conversion to hydrogen has been to transport, but whether you've also looked at some of the heat issues, particularly as you picked up the fuel poverty challenge you have in Orkney.
Yeah, we looked at a variety of storage mechanisms. We looked at batteries, we looked at, and we were eventually led towards hydrogen. That seemed sensible as a storage system, but in fact we ended up taking the hydrogen now putting it into other things. But the point even with that fuel cell system we're running, overall efficiency from the electrolysis and then into the final use in the ferries as electricity, it's about 37%, because 75% and then 50% efficient at each of those two conversion stages. So we've got quite a lump of heat to deal with. So we're keen to find other ways to do it, to do things with it. Now there are some examples around. In Shetland, they do have a district heating scheme with a decent-sized battery, and effectively it's just a big tank of water. It's not that complicated. And we believe there's a big opportunity for that sort of thing. So we are looking, certainly from EMEC's point of view, as to whether when the electrolysis is stable and we're doing this on such a continuous basis, we'll have big chunks of energy which could then be used for doing things like agriculture and aquaculture and adding value to things locally on the islands where there's naturally a tendency to grow an animal and then ship it off. You know, you don't get all the value out of it. So we can see there are some heat things in agriculture. And we've also seen there's another form of heat store, which is the ocean itself. So in Stromness, they've recently put a sea source heat pump in that heats the library now, and they're getting a coefficient of performance up to 7 on occasions from that. So the heat store that they're using is the tidal water swilling in and out every few hours. So I think we're starting to wake up to the potential that heat offers, and thank goodness we are, because it's been such a ridiculous waste that we've just focused on electricity and thrown 3/4 of the fuel out of the window. Madness.
Thank you. I'm conscious that people over at that side haven't had a chance to ask. Yeah.
Hi, good evening. I'm Lara from the University of Edinburgh. Thank you for your talk. It's really interesting to hear about the new developments in energy. We've been talking recently about how a lot of us are thinking of technology as this like saver of us. Like if we have the technology, we're gonna be able to make these like really transformative changes. So as I hear from you and different speakers, I'm wondering, to what extent do you think focusing on this power of technology to save us is being emphasized at the expense of perhaps encouraging changes in social behavior and change? Thank you.
Okay. Robert, do you want to pick that up just in terms of your thinking from Quebec, in terms of how you manage?
The less expensive energy is the energy we don't consume, you know. So efficiency is very important, and I think there is quite a lot to be done on that matter in different countries. It depends of how people use energy, it depends of the access to it, it depends on the cost of it. In Quebec, we pay 6.8 cents, Canadian cents, which means less than 2 or 3 cents in pounds, 2 or 3 penny per kilowatt hour, which is probably the cheapest electricity in the world. And the result of it is that we consume much too much energy, and where it's difficult to sell to people to try to be more efficient in their use of energy. So that's one aspect. And I think it's important to have that in mind and to have people develop new behavior concerning the consumption of energy altogether. And also in Quebec, 47% of the energy is fossil fuels altogether for the province, and it's mainly used for vehicle because most of the houses are heated by hydroelectricity. So all that to say that it depends of the context, it depends of how people use energy. And I know that elsewhere, it's energy is used very differently. And so what we're trying to do, and at the other end of the spectrum in Quebec, we have the north, where it's very, very expensive, and where we are in the extreme climate to try to introduce renewable energy technology, and that involves for us to adapt everything developed elsewhere to the specific climate context.
Thank you. I think one final question to close the session. One final killer question. Lady at the back.
No pressure. No pressure.
Hopefully I can read my writing. So for all its obvious benefits, renewable energy can still be a contentious issue, at least in some places, due to factors such as competing land uses and potential visual impacts on landscapes and seascapes. So how do we secure widespread public support for renewables, particularly if meeting future electricity transport and heat targets will likely necessitate a market increase in the number of installations?
So I think that is actually a killer question because it goes to the heart of one of the challenges.
I was planted in the audience to ask.
Goes to the heart of one of the challenges, which is people have too often seen it as a technocratic problem or an economic problem and not as a social opportunity or a challenge. Who would like to start? Neil.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was talking to Stuart, the planner from Orkney, in the break. I'm not sure he's still here, but part of the conversation we had was that when communities are proposing putting up wind turbines in Orkney, there isn't any objection, but when it's a commercial activity, there can be. So the point is, I think, understanding what it is that can, or making sure that the people who could be affected can actually see the benefit in the activity. Because if it's imposed on them, they're going to fight. If they're part of it and they see the benefit, then they're likely to play along. So I think it's really about explaining to people, showing people, demonstrating to people the benefits that can accrue. And so using models like ourselves and elsewhere where there's been successful uptake, and then getting people to come and see it and go, look, they haven't got two heads, it just works, what's your problem? We think there's a really strong case to demonstrate things and just to prove that it works, and I'm sure people will relax into it.
Anybody else want to add anything to that?
Yeah.
Go on.
I mean, we've seen, for example, in this country, people not being very keen on district heat because there have been a few bad examples of how systems don't work. And in fact, I've seen this recently as well across Central Asia, where people sort of decide to reject the old Russian networks. They much rather have a gas boiler just because stuff hasn't worked in the past. So again, you need to bring people along. There's no point trying to impose a solution they don't want. And you actually need to work very hard in areas where there's been a bad experience in the past. So, I mean, there's some good examples of, developing customer charters, etc. Although I have to say the Danes have gone quite a long way by effectively forcing people to connect to district heating. But then they've done it, and it's always worked because there's not been that bad experience. So I think regulation has a role, but you've got to give people enough time to get used to it and to demonstrate the benefits.